Thanks, Interpret Europe, for having me this morning. It's an honor to be here, and I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on what I'm going to be talking about this morning, and to have the panel discussion after the presentation. I'm really looking forward to that discussion. The presentation that I do this morning is going to be a fairly big picture. So at the Travel Foundation, we do lots of very hands-on stuff in destinations to look at how tourism operates and try to change it to improve its impacts, as Sandy was saying. But we also do believe in systems change and see that there's a need to change the system to help make sure that those impacts are improved. So I'm going to walk you through some of those ideas this morning, and I think you'll hopefully see the connection not only to resilience throughout, but also to interpretation as we, and I'll try and bring that out occasionally where I think there's some particular relevance, but hopefully we'll then be able to perhaps in the discussion afterwards to maybe take that down to some more practical examples too. So I'll just begin by sharing my screen, so please bear with me. Okay, so hopefully you can see a guy with some melons. Yeah, so today I do hope to convince you that tourism needs a new business and operating model, and basically a new mandate, so a sort of a fundamental reset as we say that we're going to build back better. But I also hope to inspire you, because we do need facilitators, interpretators, and people who understand the DNA of a destination to empower and listen and learn from local people, and to jointly develop sustainable tourism offers. So these authentic, the word that Sandy mentioned before, these are authentic local experiences that seem to be particularly in demand, and even more so seems to be from the data coming out from research companies at the moment. But first, let's just check out why there is no place for the old model of tourism. So I put a picture up there of a pretty crowded beach, but it's not just about over-tourism. That was one symptom of the old model when put under stress by too many people in one place. But regardless of whether or not a destination might be described as suffering from over-tourism before COVID, and of course, many outdoor places have experienced over-tourism during COVID too, the same challenges can be found all over the world. So destinations and businesses alike struggling with major vulnerabilities exacerbated by tourism. So this is what makes a destination not resilient: the seasonality, the economic leakages, the low margins, the overcrowding, overconsumption, and overdependence. Fragile environments, particularly in our destinations that we focus on, that's what makes them special. Exclusion and inequality, not to mention the threats from future pandemics, and of course, the climate emergency. It's these issues that we see time and time again being grappled with within destination strategies, and it's the results of these vulnerabilities that are causing an impact on communities. To take that a little bit further, in 2019, as Sandy mentioned, we published a report with Cornell University and Eplerwood International called Destinations at Risk: The Invisible Burden of Tourism. There's a lot of information out there about the economic benefits of tourism. I expect you guys will be able to trot out some of these statistics, like 1 in 10 jobs, etc. But there's very little on the costs to a destination. So we just don't know if tourism truly pays its way, whether there is a net benefit at the end of it. And if we don't know the cost, we are kind of saying that we want tourism no matter what the cost. So we highlighted an invisible burden of tourism. And this is basically the unaccounted for impacts, particularly on so-called common pool resources which make up the essence of a destination: the beaches, the parks, the built heritage, the intangible heritage and culture, as well as public infrastructure and natural resources and biodiversity. So one example, which I think illustrates this well, which is just a bit different to just thinking about generally the impacts of tourism, say the environment, is that in Rhodes, to cope with the demand, the peak demand from tourism in the summer, they had to build a oil-fired power station. So this meant not only did the people of Rhodes have to pay for that power station to be built, but they also then had to use more expensive energy in those peak months of the year, which is another expense for them. And of course, it went completely against any kind of climate targets that they had to open up a new oil-fired power station. So it's those sorts of burdens that we believe are just going completely unaccounted for and need to be factored into to the visitor economy. So I'm now just going to play you a quick 2-minute film, which will hopefully work, and that will give you a quick overview of the invisible burden in a much better way than I'll be able to. So I'll just fire that one on now.
International tourism is rising and fast. In 2018, arrivals reached 1.4 billion. While tourism can bring economic development and other benefits, it also brings a range of hidden costs. Wherever it exists, tourism places an invisible burden on destinations. On the face of it, tourism pays its way. Tourists spend their money on local services, and businesses pay local taxes and utility bills. But many costs are not accounted for, such as the cost to upgrade infrastructure beyond resident needs to meet tourism demand, the cost to manage and protect public spaces and natural habitats, the cost of increased exposure to climate change risks, and the cost to locals of rising house and land prices driven by the demand from tourism. Either residents are left to pick up the tab, or it's just not paid, leaving the environment and other public assets to suffer. When visitor numbers are low, the invisible burden goes largely unnoticed. But as tourism grows, every new visitor brings unanticipated costs to the destination. As the invisible burden escalates, destinations become spoiled and residents protest or are forced to leave. Failing to account for tourism's invisible burden puts fragile ecosystems, cultural wonders, and community life at risk. This puts tourism on a weak foundation that could crack under its own weight. But it doesn't have to be this way. Destinations need our attention and resources. Dynamic leadership, new talent, investment platforms, and analysis of the invisible burden will benefit visitors and residents alike, now and for generations to come. Find out more.
Okay, that's a find out more at invisibleburden.org. So that's where you can go to download the report for free, and I'd urge you to have at least a good skim through that report if you haven't done already, because there's lots of really interesting stuff in there, including case studies and that sort of thing too. Okay, so that was our sort of understanding then of why some of these vulnerabilities are there within destinations. And we were increasingly seeing destinations that were put under pressure, particularly from over-tourism at the time. And like I say, over-tourism hasn't gone away. It's just shifted to new places, and we can be sure that it will return rather quickly if the old model remains as we begin to recover. But let's sort of try and lift ourselves up a bit now after sort of telling you that tourism is fundamentally flawed. I think all of us here will feel that tourism offers lots of potential for making often vulnerable places and vulnerable lives better. It can be a force for good to deliver against sustainable development goals and to improve quality of life. And perhaps now is the time for change. I think there's lots of reasons for us to be more positive and optimistic about the future. So there are many external drivers for change. Some of these have been around for some time, and some of them are a bit more recent. So we are soon to have COP26, the climate talks, the international climate talks, and I think that there is a real shift in both public opinion and I think corporate opinion actually around climate. And actually just last week we were involved in something called the Glasgow Declaration and making that public, which is a commitment that we have launched with the UN World Tourism Organization and UN Environment Programme and others to basically align our sector behind science-based targets, reducing carbon by half by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So we're going to be launching that at COP26, and we hope to have some really big players involved in that commitment. So I think we can see and we will hopefully encourage this shift in mindset. I think we may be getting to a tipping point, at least around commitments, maybe not quite yet action. Also, we've had campaigns such as the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think has raised some really fundamental questions about equity in tourism and the relationship between outbound and inbound, the relationship between visitor and host, which is at the center of interpretation, I think. We've had residents initially campaigning around things like overtourism, and we've seen protests in places in Europe and elsewhere where residents have really been the drive behind the phenomenon that is overtourism, and the need to put that into check with sort of new mayors and that sort of thing coming in with an overtourism ticket. And I think residents will be questioning the return of tourism, having had their towns and cities and places to themselves largely for the last 18 months. They will now be questioning the value of tourism in a different way, I think. And customers, of course. So customers can drive change. We've certainly seen that with things like single-use plastic as a particularly sort of totemic environmental issue. Although I think we can also say that customer demand can be rather limiting as well. We haven't really seen it drive a demand for green certification, for instance, although there may be lots of reasons for that. And at the Travel Foundation, we believe that the change really needs to come from the industry, and we need to shape what customers are demanding. COVID itself, these last 18 months, it's obviously caused lots of change. So talking about on a slide of a time for change, change is already here. It's already happened. COVID has massively changed supply and demand, the landscape. And you know, this can be seen as an opportunity to reshape the visitor economy as it #builds back better. And perhaps that's not simply an empty platitude. I mean, we've seen lots of people jumping on the Build Back Better hashtag, but actually tourism has moved higher up the agenda. I think we have seen a much greater public-private cooperation. Certainly the private sector has seen the importance of the public sector to essentially bail it out in times of difficulty. And the public sector, I think, has seen that the tourism itself is perhaps more important than they had previously given it credit for. And I think as we move into a recovery phase, we will see that there are new finances available for economic packages that can be sort of purposed in a way that will encourage a better kind of recovery. And already we've seen that that's the case with certain packages, particularly within Europe, actually. But what does Build Back Better really mean? better means different things to different people. So last year, we joined forces with 5 other global tourism NGOs. And to note, actually, that green destinations in there, I believe, is your keynote for tomorrow. So say hello to Albert for me and see if he mentions the Future of Tourism Coalition. But we joined forces with 5 other global NGOs last year for the first time to seek to unite the industry around a set of 13 guiding principles that can guide tourism recovery efforts with a goal, with a goal of reframing how success is measured beyond traditional growth metrics, while putting destinations and communities at the center of tourism's future. So here are the 13 guiding principles, and I won't go through them all one by one, but hopefully you get a sense, at least just from these headings, as to the kind of vision that we have for tourism. And you can go onto the website, futureoftourism.org, to get a bit more around each of these guiding principles. There's a bit more of an explanation around each one. So then these are meant as a framework for aligning this great sentiment of Build Back Better into something a bit more tangible and actionable. It's a vision not just shared by the 6 NGOs, but with actually more than 600 organizations now who have signed up to this. Destinations and businesses, some really big names and many small names, a real interesting and wonderful mix, actually, that near enough reflects tourism as a whole. Although I will say that we have stronger representation geographically in some places than others. And we're obviously working on that. But lots and lots of interesting and wonderful organizations have come together, basically, become signatories. And these principles have already served to inspire tourism plans and strategies. So I'd encourage you to find out more and join this movement, actually, at thefutureoftourism.org, where we're just about to launch an online community as a forum for an exchange of ideas, inspiration, and experiences among those who share this vision of building back better. I think it's a genuinely unique and global community, and we're actually really excited about bringing people together to see if how we can support each other as we tackle some of the many challenges in trying to achieve this vision. So when seeking to rebuild tourism, we need a new model, or else we will fall back to the old and broken ways of doing tourism. And I'm going to suggest that we have 5 issues to tackle with the current model. So here, I believe, are 5 systemic limitations. So firstly, a limited mandate. What do we mean by that? So I'm here really talking about how tourism is managed within a destination now. And the role of managing tourism is one that can be quite complicated to unpick. There's lots of different people managing tourism at all sorts of different levels in different organizations, or maybe no one's managing tourism at all. But if there is any kind of management going on, it's probably through the destination management organization or marketing organization, whichever M they choose. And the mandate that they have is very often given mostly by tourism businesses. And therefore, the mandate is essentially to ensure that hotel beds, attractions, coach seats are filled. And so it's essentially a mandate for growth and keeping the vitality of the visitor economy going. Limited KPIs, so linked to the limited mandate, we all know, I think, that the metrics tend to be linked to growth and volume again. So as I said before, we can very easily tell you how many visitor arrivals there have been to a destination. We can very easily tell you the percentage of GDP that tourism contributes to. But we can't really tell you much about any of the costs and any of the other values that we might expect tourism to have. And I'll go into this in a bit more detail in a few slides' time. But clearly, as well as there being an invisible burden, we sort of talk about an invisible benefits of tourism too, that all of those different values that are going unnoticed. Limited structures and influence. Really, tourism really does seem to act in very much a silo. It often doesn't really talk to others in the placemaking world. It's certainly at this management level that I'm talking about. And it's not talking and engaging with people. It's not talking and engaging with asset managers, those who are managing some of those heritage and cultural sites that we've already mentioned. And then a limited skill set. It's really not okay, I think, really, for us to expect that destination management organizations should go from being a marketing organization to suddenly being a management organization, whilst they have the same skill set and the same resources and funding. It doesn't seem right that we should just push that requirement onto DMOs without understanding that the requirements are very different, and actually it's a very different organization that's needed to manage tourism in that way. So I'm just going to look at some enablers now. So we talk about having needing a reset, and we need to push a reset button. Well, I've got 3 reset buttons for you here. And I'm going to go through each of these in turn through the rest of the this presentation. So the first one is a reset with resident priorities. So we think that a fundamental way of changing how tourism works and operates is by putting residents and community priorities first, by giving a voice to those who aren't directly involved in the visitor economy, but who are impacted by it, as well as bringing people in to the visitor economy itself. So that's sort of reset button number 1. And reset button number 2 is to be more inclusive and localized within the visitor economy itself. So that's looking at the makeup of tourism and the visitor economy, and being intentional about being more equitable and local, unleashing local talent and creativity. And thirdly, it's about developing low impact experiences, driven by the science, driven by data in areas such as climate and heritage asset management. So I think with low impact, it's not just about bringing in a circular economy. It's not just about reducing carbon. It's about actually the impact on a destination of the visitor economy as a whole, how it's experienced, how it's felt. So I'm now going to explore these 3 reset buttons in a little more detail, focusing in particular on the first reset button, because we think that by basically placing residents first, that is a fundamental change and driver in the model and in the system. So I'm going to suggest firstly that we ask a simple question. Why do we want tourism? So we've seen a bit of a trend in destinations at the moment, seeking more resident engagement, or at least trying to better understand the sentiment of their residents. This tends to then be the form of an attitudinal survey, and more often than not, that's really just to minimize risk. Just to make sure that residents aren't likely to start protesting anytime soon, rather really than changing approaches. I might be being a bit unfair there, but it's certainly tinkering around the edges rather than a fundamental kind of change by asking this question: why do we want tourism? It seems like a really simple question, but we find it can be quite transformational. It's asking people, what do they value from tourism? What is tourism for? So it's not just tourism for tourism's sake. We're bringing people here, and we expect that this is going to somehow enrich our lives. And yes, there's the obvious economic benefits, jobs and and links to the local economy are likely to be high up there in priorities. But there's many other reasons why people like to be in a place that is visited. It might be that it's a sense of pride and a sense of having a place in the world. It might be that it's something to do with better connectivity to the rest of the world, or even that it's just improved amenities and services, better nightlife, better, a buzz, all that kind of stuff. And now it's never a better time than now to ask this question. We've had changes in demand and changes in supply. That has meant that residents have been asking, why do we want tourism? And maybe in a very positive way. They may have seen that some of the impacts of a lack of tourism, not all being just the case that they maybe can drive around a bit more easily in their town or whatever it is. When we're asking this question, we have to think about the we within the question. So who do we mean by we? And I think we need to ask lots of different groups, actually. So residents broadly, but we can focus in on particular community groups. We should ask businesses, tourism related businesses, and more broadly, we can ask the visitors and destination asset managers about tourism too. So we need a good representation and diversity of opinion. And we need to try and seek areas of consensus as well as identifying areas of conflict if we're going to start to work towards a sort of a shared vision of why we want tourism in the first place. And as interpreters of people and place, I think you can help to ensure that an understanding of the authentic DNA and values of a place remain at the core of this discussion. So we've seen people try to use net promotional scores, for instance, for residents. So not just for visitors, but also for residents, asking what are they proud of about their destination, about their place. And what is it about the place that makes a difference to their lives? It might be that it's a cherished restaurant, a green space, the outlook of the people, and it's understanding the need to manage these destination assets, both tangible and intangible. And I think that interpretation has a really strong role in that discussion. So this means a much broader understanding of value, not just economic. And you will know that what communities value most will differ from place to place. Of course, as well as the invisible burden, as I said, we see that there are also invisible benefits, the added value for the destination and residents. And it's important to get hold of these impacts if tourism is going to be truly valued by the destination. It also means that people involved in tourism can have, I think, a seat at the table in other discussions. So if we're talking about access to more amenities and events, you will want to have control, or at least some say in those amenities events. And I think you can have a seat at the table if you can show the value that bringing visitors has on that side of things. Similarly for things like enhanced infrastructure, going back to the need for maybe better energy provision during high peak demand and that sort of thing. Around protecting assets, these historical and natural and cultural assets that we need to better understand the impacts of tourism, but also understand the role that these assets have in a community, and attracting new businesses and talent. We need to understand what it is about tourism that is most valued and what kind of visitor economy is most likely to bring this to your destination. It's probably worth saying at this point that lots of people see that they want to switch from a volume-based visitor economy to a value-based visitor economy. And too often, by switching to value, they are just talking about economic value. And that near enough then translates into we need to get very rich people to come and visit our place. And even worse, that might then translate simply into, therefore, we must have lots of golf courses and maybe a marina for some yachts and that sort of thing. Whereas really truly understanding value in its broader sense, I think, helps you to think about a different kind of optimal mix of tourism. So, it's not necessarily the case that the 5-star hotels and visitors are going to have the lightest footprint, for instance. They, often have high energy needs and water needs and that sort of thing. And it may not be that they are really buying local, for instance. It may be that they're, more interested in sort of imported goods. And it may be that the jobs aren't the same, at least within that kind of tourism. It's just understanding the different dynamics of tourism and what is most likely to get you what you want. So resetting with resident priorities is much more than doing a resident survey. And I've got a few examples here. So the city of Barcelona, I expect many of you know this, has established a tourism council from 2016 as a representative body of community groups, industry, academia, and city council members. The council is a forum for discussing and planning the future of tourism in the city. And the council also puts forward recommendations to city council on allocation of tax revenues. Greenland is seeking to implement a law that requires all destinations to carry out annual surveys on resident sentiment towards tourism. Cities like Helsinki, Reykjavik, Bordeaux are working with participatory budgeting, where citizens decide how part of the city's budget is spent. And Amsterdam aims to earmark part of its tourism tax revenue to community funds to empower local citizens and businesses to influence investment in neighborhood development. Even before COVID, there was definitely a move from marketing to management. I expect you're familiar with this debate, and from volume to value. And you can see that in late 2019 and early 2020, many of these reports on your screen now were being published. So Netherlands published their Perspectives 2030, where they said that more is not always better, and from tourism as a goal to tourism as a means, which I think is pretty much summing up what I'm saying here. And they talk about attracting quality tourists. I would probably rather that they talked about quality tourism, but we can maybe debate that later if it's worth debating. And similarly, Edinburgh 2030, they talked about from driving growth to managing growth. COVID has accelerated many of the drivers behind this, but we can't expect destinations and DMOs in particular to go from being marketing to management organizations overnight, as I've said before. We need to change the model, as highlighted already, the mandate, the skill set, the organizational structures. So we have got a tool here, which we developed and published this year with the World Travel and Tourism Council and the European Tourism Futures Institute. So we looked at the trends and the future of tourism as we return and recover, and saw that there are many drivers towards what we call destination stewardship. And some of those have been very long-term drivers, such as this move from marketing to management, for instance, maybe the digitalization of tourism, this move to include residents and to be more of a placemaking function within the visitor economy. But we did see this need for structural change. And so we looked at the aspects of governance and how they might help or hinder the pursuit of destination stewardship. So we created this framework, which you may just be able to make out in the screen in front of you. And I won't go into it in too much detail now, but the report is freely available on the WTTC website. It's a framework that I think can be applied at any level. You could do this at a national level, but equally you could go right down to sort of district or attraction level, and just think through either, again, applying it quite broadly in terms of how you generally manage tourism or the visitor economy, or you can go really quite specific with this and say, okay, there's a specific issue that we have. How is that issue being managed at the moment in our place? And you can start to look through strategic vision, implementation, the kinds of collaboration that we have and that are needed, et cetera, et cetera. It's intended to be a facilitated approach, and so the 3 organizations that develop this, we have also looked at the kinds of workshops and sort of structured deliberative processes that might be needed to bring different stakeholders together to actually kind of unpick how they're managing tourism. And we would sort of, basically be able to facilitate that and encourage all relevant stakeholders to be involved. So there's a big focus on public-private community collaboration here, and I'd be interested to explore what this audience today feels the role of interpretation is within that discussion and within that collaboration. We talk about engaging with communities and those responsible for managing assets, and we need to identify those who can represent the voices that are currently not being heard. So that moves me onto the next reset button, and I'll be quicker with the next 2, around localizing. So I'm going to use the word authentic again, but I'm going to explore these terms really, because words like local, community, and authentic, I mean, they can be tricky, and they're even open to abuse. We've sort of used the term local washing in the past as a sort of a form of greenwashing, if you like. And just because something is apparently local may not actually mean that real solid benefits are being provided to local people. So at the Travel Foundation, we do a lot of work that's aimed at localizing tourism products and supply chains. On the screen, we have some Taste of Fethiye cucumbers, and Taste of Fethiye is a project that we ran in Turkey, in the region of Fethiye in Turkey. And these cucumbers were grown within a few miles of the hotels that were serving them. Perhaps we can again talk about the Taste of Fethiye project in a little bit more detail later. But certainly there is no consensus on what local means. Locally owned businesses, maybe locally produced, locally distributed or purchased. Does it just mean not imported, which in somewhere like Turkey could mean still quite a long way away? Whereas elsewhere, that might just be just over the border, right? So these are tricky definitions. And this is a problem for organizations such as the big hotel chains. I've put Hilton and Marriott up on the screen there, and they have these real targets that they are committed to delivering around local sourcing. But they need to then sort of try and figure out what they mean by that and not get too sort of caught up in this minefield, if you like. So, particularly highlighting, we've got local here, we've got minority owned, we've got SMEs. These things have various definitions depending on who you talk to or where you go. And it's something that we don't, obviously don't want to get sort of tripped up on, when really what we're trying to do is just make sure that local benefits are accrued. So with Taste of Fethiye, we worked with small scale farmers who were interested in diversifying their markets to benefit from tourism demand. It provided a spark for local talent and creativity, from chefs changing their menus to reflect more traditional or local cuisine, to excursions that enabled visitors to explore the journey from farm to fork. So we found that by really engaging with the farmers, with the supply chain, with the hotels, we were able to do a lot more than simply get some vegetables from a farm to a plate. And this is, I think, interpretation demonstrating that localizing means more than proximity. It needs interpretation of a vision, of the DNA of a place, and we need to understand local as meaning equitable, allowing communities to determine their own future and supporting marginalized groups to be heard. Coming to the end now, low impact was the last of my reset buttons. So low impact tourism means we must understand and prioritize future risks from climate, from overconsumption, wherever those drivers may come from. So I'm not really talking low impact just simply about sort of technologies, although things like obviously green energy, new infrastructure, introducing a more circular economy, being able to have recycling infrastructure and that sort of thing, that's all really important and clearly a major part of low impact. but I'm trying to broaden that a bit more from just those sorts of initiatives that I think are, there are technological solutions for much of that just needs to be invested in. I'm thinking about facilitating a more regenerative relationship between visitors and the sites they visit. So we need to consider the cost being borne by places like national parks, ancient sites, public spaces, which have very little benefit to, with very little benefit to offset this. So, often these places are used, and there may even be sort of regulation to say that you can't charge to use some of these places, and yet they have these costs borne on them, and we need to think creatively about changing the relationship between visitors and those sites so that it can be more regenerative, bearing in mind, going back to this invisible burden concept that I introduced earlier. So low impact is likely to mean more intentional management of visitors with an understanding of capacity and flow, potentially using smart technology to influence this. I know places like Venice are really investing in that kind of technology at the moment to try to basically manage and improve the experience for everyone. And again, I think there's a role for interpreters here. So can you help to be a barometer of a destination, to identify the issues before they become problems? Can you be the facilitator that brings about collaborations such as voluntary codes of conduct and these sorts of structures that we need to ensure that tourism is managing its impacts and, like I say, is changing that relationship with visitor and place? And I'm very much looking forward to hearing your views on all of this. Thank you very much.
Ben, thank you very much for your presentation. There was a lot in it, and a lot that I think our community as interpreters can see some good hooks for us in the work that we do and the relevance that we can bring to some of the points that you raised there. I just made some notes about some of the phrases that you use, like reset buttons. I mean, that's a strong it's a strong term because it suggests that something is wrong, or we've something is out of control or uncontrolled, and we need to reset things. And it kind of goes with the times, unfortunately, that we live in at the moment. I feel volumes to values as well was a very strong one there, and you raised the point about, well, what does that actually mean? How is that interpreted? Certainly, as interpreters, values means much more than just economic values for us. And another word that you used there, which should make a lot of us sort of sit up, is stewardship, which is a very strong word in the interpretive community, because stewardship is really translated means about caring about something. And if you care about something, then you respect it. And if you respect it, then you're more likely to want to protect it, either directly or support its protection. So these are strong terms that you used in your presentation there, and something that build bridges towards the interpretive community, as far as I can see. We have a number of comments and questions coming in. Perhaps I could just start off with maybe just how close to destination stewardship do you think we are, and will it be open to all?
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, I mean, I think destination stewardship's a really helpful concept. I like destination stewardship, and I like placemaking as well, as a broader understanding of the visitor economy, basically, because I will use terms like destination, but that's clearly very loaded as a tourism concept rather than a resident doesn't feel like that, doesn't refer to their place as a destination, it's their home. But in terms of destination stewardship, I think that it's really clear. I mean, the way that we understand destination stewardship, at least, or the way that we understood it within the report that I shared with the WTTC and European Tourism Futures Institute, is that it has to have that public-private and community collaboration. And then with that, you then couple that with putting the needs of the destination at the front. And I think then you can say that you have destination stewardship. So how close are we to that? Unfortunately, I think we're a long way off. And that's part of the reason, of course, for the sort of work that we were doing with people like WTTC to kind of advocate for this change in approach. And I hope that we will be able to demonstrate that ourselves at the Travel Foundation. In future, we've just had announced a partnership with a tour operator where they're partnering with us as their destination stewardship partner to facilitate this kind of approach within 5 of their destinations, for instance. And so we very sort of hopeful that we can start to demonstrate, what true destination stewardship could look like. I think it exists in pockets and in places. It's partial, so sometimes a destination might have done a really great job on bringing everyone together over a single issue, maybe, but it certainly isn't an approach that, if you're going to ask me where does it well, I would, which I have been asked many times, and it's really difficult to really say that. Like I said, we could kind of point to certain destinations that have done certain things at certain times well, but when it comes to who's really got this, I don't think it's very easy to give those examples. And if you do, it might be some fairly niche destinations where it's possibly a little easier to have this kind of focus. Where we really want to see it is in some much more mainstream destinations. But there's lots of reasons. I think I guess I showed the some of the barriers to this within the presentation. That we can see that there's many barriers to a collaborative approach, and one that truly understands the needs of the destination. And each of those needs to be addressed, and that's one of the reasons why we were saying that we need to have we need to have a bit more of a structural view of this. There's loads you can do informally. So I mean, looking at that framework that I put up before, which has those sort of different areas that you can look at, it does, structural change takes many years. So we're not, we don't want to freak people out by talking to about structural change and then thinking, well, that means changing my funding mechanisms. Well, that's really difficult for me. I can't just do that overnight or whatever. But there are also lots of sort of softer things that you can do, be mindful of the things that may need to change over the long term and start making, steps towards those changes. But equally, there's loads and loads of things that you might be able to do in the short term as well. Softer changes, just, informal collaborations and that sort of thing. And, engaging with residents and that sort of thing, changing, you can subtly change a mandate, even if it's not a formal thing, and all the rest of it. So so that's that's what I would say. It's possible, and there's lots of reasons to be optimistic. That time for change slide that I put up there, but I think it's definitely a vision for the future, rather than something that we can really say we are nearly there with.
Thanks for that, Ben. There's while we've been talking, there's a number of comments and questions come in, and I'd like to put them to you, if I may.
Yeah, great.
I realize, just looking at the time, we're overrunning a bit, but I would suggest that we answer as many of the questions and comments as we can, and then, seeing as we're all here on the same platform, we can sort of seamlessly, as it were, move into the panel discussion.
Yeah, I guess if Carol and Jane have any follow up to anything I say, then I'd love it not to just be me all the time. If they've got some good opinions. So.
Yes. Helena mentioned the reaction to the slide with the 13 guiding principles. And could you imagine one being heritage interpretation, or connecting locals and visitors with heritage based on values?
I mean, absolutely. It's funny because obviously we published these 13, and then lots of we've had lots of debate since then about were they the right 13. And should we have had 15? Should we had 5? And I think probably it's difficult because there were lots of organizations that would like to see sort of a high profile for an area. What we were trying to do as best as we possibly could was have a vision where things like bringing the community through. I mean, that's fundamentally at the heart of this vision. Across all of the 13 guiding principles, we say right up front, we've got to put the destination and the community at the center of tourism, and then we're trying to then sort of build that up, if you like, with those 13 principles. And yeah, I agree. Yes, I think actually, if you looked behind those sort of headings of the 13, I think you would really recognize much of what is being said as interpretation, and of that kind of facilitation role between communities and businesses and the visitor economy. So I think that it's a very interesting world, tourism. It's so intersectional with so many different sort of cross lines going through it, in terms of we've talked about climate change, and should that be a separate thing or just across the whole thing? Equity, should that be across the whole thing? And yes, they are. That it's sort of a mix of trying to pick some issues out specifically, but then having themes that run behind them. But I hope that I've sort of demonstrated today that we see that kind of dynamic by bringing the community and bringing the sense of place to the forefront of our vision, that is certainly embedded in the whole thing. Yeah,
thank you. There's just one further point I'd like to make before we move into the panel discussion, and then we can take some of the questions, if we can, as the discussion evolves. It's really that there's a point made by Larissa Pietri of one point to take into consideration, that is that local people don't know or have no idea about their city or their environment, their cultural heritage, their local museums. And when they do, then they suddenly begin to appreciate it. So some people are sort of blind to things right under their noses.
And I like that. I mean, this is why I quite like the idea of placemaking, because visitor economy, yes, to a lot of people that I'm talking to, it's about the visitors, right? And that's how we understand it. And even that, it might even be tourism, but more broadly, we can talk about visitors. And that's kind of their job, to bring the visitors in, make sure the visitors have a good time, good experiences, understand a place, and then leave behind lots of nice money and that kind of thing. But actually, placemaking, I kind of prefer it as a concept, because it does then involve residents too. It's actually what is the vision for the place? Where does the place want to be in 10 years' time, and how can the visitor economy actually contribute to that? And I think that that's tied into this idea of what do residents value, but also maybe what don't they value that they maybe could or should, where are the opportunities and where's the potential to really sort of open up some areas, and maybe even explore some areas of the past that might be even uncomfortable, but you should have a debate on, and that kind of thing. So so I think I would say if we're going to have a vision for tourism, it also needs to be a vision for a place too. So it needs to be a clear connection between where a place sees itself and where it wants to be, and how it's going to encourage the well-being of its residents and the interest of its residents, and connect that to, well, now if we bring people in, how is that going to help with that vision? And so that's how I would sort of see that going. But I think, that what a great point to make. And I think during COVID, when visitors have dropped off in many places, it's been a sort of an added impetus for people to engage with their residents. They have been their new audience in a sense for the first time for many of these organizations, where they felt that they've needed to communicate to residents what the situation is with their businesses. Are they open? Are they closed? Have they changed their services and all that kind of thing? And also encouraging residents and those in the local proximity to be the customers. And I think that that's really healthy to to have. Again, not to see a visitor economy as for visitors, and then as some separate thing going on over here for residents. Really, we're going to get that combined value if what we are providing for visitors is absolutely what residents also want. And that's where we should be focusing on developing tourism, so that it's absolutely, if we're going to open up a new attraction or a new service, it's because we know that that's going to be really valued by our residents and supported by visitors.